It's going down, and you're invited for what they selling. We ain't buying, there is no running, there is no hiding, there's only fighting or dying. It's going down, and you're invited for what they selling. We ain't buying, there is no running, there is no hiding, there's only fighting or dying.
It's Going Down is a digital community center from anarchist, anti-fascist, autonomous, anti-capitalist, and anti-colonial movements. Our mission is to provide an autonomous and resilient platform to publicize and promote revolutionary theory and action.
Go to itsgoingdown.org for daily updates. Check out our online store for ways to donate, and rate and follow us on iTunes if you like this podcast.
Hi, I'm Zoe Baker, pronouns she, her. I have a PhD in the history of the revolutionary strategy of anarchism in Europe and the United States. I make YouTube videos where I explain the theory and history of anarchism, feminism, and Marxism. And I also kind of post lots of bad jokes and random facts on Twitter, which no one should spend any time on, especially me.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. Been a fan of your work for a long time. And thanks for coming on the show. We're excited to talk about, anarchist history and strategy, and especially kind of connecting how anarchists historically have dealt with these questions of organization and strategy and tactics, and how that relates kind of to today, where we're still having the same questions over and over again. But just to get started, how did you get drawn into studying anarchism and anarchist history?
So when I was an alienated teenager, I read Kropotkin. I think the first anarchist book I properly read was The Conquest of Bread. And then I became kind of obsessed with reading all the dead anarchists. So, I'd go through the Wikipedia page, find all their names, find their books, and then read them all in a kind of, the way one might complete everything in a video game. I was trying to do that, but for the history of anarchism. And then the more I read, the more interest I became in the topic. And then it somehow ended up that I was, doing actual history, like writing history myself rather than just reading other people's history. And one of the things that really drew me to it as a field was that growing up, I had this kind of assumption that people alive in the 21st century, obviously so much more progressive and forward thinking than people in the past were, who obviously had inferior ideas. And then I read what the people in the past had to say from the 19th century and was amazed to discover that actually on a lot of issues, they were far ahead of loads of people alive today. And this is, not questions of wanting to abolish capitalism in the state, but, there are loads of, say, historic anarchists who are much better on racism and gender oppression than, say, loads of people alive now who continue to be racist and, patriarchal. And I just found that really interesting, that kind of this myth of progress I'd been socialized into wasn't all the case, and that actually we can learn a lot from previous generations of radicals. And obviously not just kind of repeat what they say, and we have to update their ideas, come up with our own ideas, but I still find how radical they were during their time period very inspiring and kind of gives me hope for the future.
So I don't think we've actually done this on this show, but how would you define anarchism?
So this is one of those questions where every anarchist will have a different answer. And part of why it's so messy is that what anarchism is even taken to mean varies over time and between places. So what anarchism means in the 1850s is different than what it means in the 1870s. And this also changes depending on a US context versus a European context. And it gets, very messy. And so I'm just going to say what anarchism means to me. And I'm not saying this is the one true anarchism. This is just, when I say I'm an anarchist, I mean, I believe this. So for me, anarchism is a form of anti-state socialism, which first emerges in the 19th century. It seeks the abolition of all systems of domination and exploitation in favor of a society in which everyone is free, equal, and bonded together through relations of cooperation and mutual support. Historically, anarchists called this society anarchy, although a lot of modern people don't use that terminology anymore because it sounds kind of punk rock and scary to some people. Now, in order to achieve this goal of anarchy, or what you might call an anarchist society, anarchists think we have to abolish capitalism and the state alongside loads of other oppressive structures. So patriarchy, racism, ableism, the oppression of children by adults, the oppression of people who are very elderly, and so forth. And this is a goal which anarchists share with a lot of other social movements, including Marxism. Now, what distinguishes anarchism from these other social movements is the strategies it proposes to achieve this goal of universal human emancipation. So it rejects electoral politics, so forming political parties which engage in elections and try to win state power, as well as attempts to seize state power through armed struggle and then kind of launch a coup, put our party in charge of the state, and then reorganize society through the state. Anarchists instead think we should remain outside and against the state, and that in order to abolish capitalism and the state simultaneously, because anarchists think they mutually reinforce one another, so you have to abolish them both at the same time, that we should launch a social revolution, which means a total restructuring of society, during which the working classes expropriate the ruling classes, establish the common ownership of the means of production and land, and they establish networks of workplace and community assemblies which enable workers to self-manage their lives themselves. So the social revolution isn't when we put new representatives in charge of society, it's when we overthrow the ruling classes and establish our own organs of self-organization. And so in order to do this, we have to be engaging in direct action. Workers have to act for themselves to achieve their emancipation, rather than hoping a politician's going to save them. And crucially, this requires a commitment to internationalism, because in order to abolish capitalism and the state, it has to occur internationally, which means workers from around the world have to learn to work together, which means overcoming things like patriotism, and instead being committed to universal human emancipation and everyone from around the world working together to liberate ourselves. And anarchists, although they reject seizing state power, do understand that the ruling classes are extremely violent. The police are violent, the army are violent. That's what one of their main functions is, violence. And so it will be necessary for workers to defend themselves from the ruling classes in order to succeed and overthrow them. But crucially, whatever kind of systems of armed self-defense that we are forced to use to defend ourselves from the violence of the ruling classes, that we don't in so doing create a new state based on minority rule rather than the self-organization of workers. So that is an attempt at summarizing what anarchism means to me.
You mentioned that you see anarchism as a form of anti-state socialism, which of course is a word that's being used and thrown around a lot, whether it's in the UK, associated with people like Jeremy Corbyn, or in the US, associated with like Bernie Sanders or AOC. I'm just curious, looking back, especially like where anarchism as like an idea on paper and an action with the word associated came out of, why is it important for you to define it as like an anti-state socialist body of thought?
Well, anarchists are socialists because we advocate the abolition of capitalism in favor of a society in which there are no classes, in which the means of production and land are owned in common, so that everyone has the real possibility to develop themselves and become the best versions of themselves. So whereas under capitalism, we aren't able to do that because of poverty and borders and bureaucracy. Instead, when the workers themselves no longer work for a capitalist, but produce in order to satisfy human need, or in order to enable the flourishing of human beings, when that's the center point of production, then I think that's a socialist society, and was understood to be socialism since the 19th century. But there are obviously many different kinds of socialism, and what, like with the word anarchism, what socialism means varies over time. And so we've now reached a point where you've got people calling themselves socialists who aren't anti-capitalists, who essentially want welfare programs through the state under capitalism. So people like AOC, Corbyn, Bernie Sanders, they are not socialists in the sense that I'm using the term. They can obviously call themselves what they want. And I'm I think it's important to continue to use socialism in the way that it was understood to mean by, say, historic workers in Europe and in radical social movements that they created themselves, where for them socialism meant emancipation from all forms of domination and exploitation through some kind of system of social ownership and control by workers themselves. And so I'll keep calling myself a socialist, and obviously other people who support welfare states under capitalism can use whatever words they want. Just because a word was used historically in a certain way doesn't mean the meaning can't change. But we are, of course, just different political traditions. We have different aims.
Many people would point out that anarchist ideas and forms of life have always existed, or they've been a tendency within human communities long before anarchist actually became a movement or a term or a body of thought. I'm just curious, your thoughts on that, just this recurring tendency of anarchic organization and action.
Okay, so I've got a few points. So, to clarify, when I say that anarchism is a historically specific form of anti-state socialism that first emerges in the 19th century, I am absolutely not denying the existence of political philosophies or social movements which advocated the abolition of class society prior to, in parallel with, or after the emergence of anarchism in my sense of the term. I'm not denying the existence of stateless societies which have developed political philosophies about the kind of society they wanted to live in, and developed really complicated social structures and relations to achieve this goal. Like, this is one of the things because I've been reading a bunch of anthropology recently, and this is like a recurring theme, is like people in state societies have their own political philosophies, and I think that should absolutely be respected and talked about. I just don't think we should call these other social movements or political philosophies or societies anarchist or examples of anarchism. Now, the reason why is that I think it's anachronistic to impose this label, which is first adopted as a term for a political ideology from the 1840s onwards. Proudhon, who you mentioned earlier, is the first person that we know of to do so, and then a bunch of other people do this as well, and then by the 1870s it refers to a social movement. Instead, what I think we should do is that we should refer to these other political traditions with the labels that they themselves used. So to give an example, in England there's a political theorist and kind of activist called Gerard Winstanley, who advocated the abolition of feudalism, private property, the state, class society in the 17th century. And so he's advocating a lot of similar ideas to what later people in the 19th century would advocate and call anarchism. But I don't think we should call Winstanley an anarchist. I think we should call him what he understood himself to be an advocate of, which was he called himself a true leveller, which is a cool name. And I think that's the name we should use to refer to him, rather than imposing this other category and kind of incorporating into a distinct history. In a similar fashion, I won't call the Zapatistas anarchists. I'll call them Zapatistas because that's the terminology that they've developed. And so in this model, anarchism to me is just is one variant of a general tendency in human history to seek the abolition of oppression and hierarchy in favor of a free and equal horizontal society. And quite a few kind of modern anarchists think, due to, say, reading books like Demanding the Impossible by Peter Marshall, or reading Kropotkin's Encyclopedia Britannica article, that anarchism is this transhistorical tendency across history. And they often refer to these texts as a kind of reason for their way of thinking. And I think it's important to point out in response to that there are lots of other historic anarchists who are very explicit that they think anarchism first emerges in the 19th century, such as Malatesta or Fabry. Although you can also point to anarchists in Japan and China who say the same things. So there's a Japanese anarchist called Kubu Yuzuru, and apologies to Japanese people if I'm saying it wrong. But he writes, in 1928, that anarchism originated from the facts of the struggle of the workers. Without that, there would be no anarchism. Or there's a Chinese anarchist called Li Yaotang, who argued in 1927 that anarchism isn't an idle dream that transcends time, but it's a product of the mass movement, so as in the workers' movement, and he thinks it couldn't have emerged before the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution. And when they're saying this, they're not saying that there's no, previous kinds of radical anti-statist, anti-class like thought. They're just, for them, anarchism is a subset of that wider tradition. And to make my final point, I think it's really important that anarchists today engage with these similar political traditions, such as the Zapatistas. I don't think what anarchism is has to be limited by its history. So if a modern person wants to develop a version of anarchism that's heavily influenced by their own culture, such as the particular indigenous group they belong to, say in America, then I absolutely welcome this. I think it's excellent. I'm very excited to hear the ideas they have and how I can learn from them. And to me, this is no different to how historic anarchists in Asia in the early 20th century, they didn't just repeat what Kropotkin said, although they read Kropotkin and liked his ideas, but they also developed their own ideas based on their own circumstances and cultural context. So there's a Chinese anarchist called He Yin-jen, and she had a background in Chinese philosophy and knew a lot about Confucianism. And she would use this background to develop concepts of which to argue for women's emancipation and for which to understand the way in which women are oppressed. That actually result in her reaching some really interesting conclusions that I think are, say, much more philosophically rigorous than what Emma Goldman advocates, who's a kind of more well-known figure. And so just as He combining anarchism with her own cultural context resulted in, I think, a very important innovation to anarchist theory, well, I think that can continue to happen now, and I'm very excited when people attempt to do this.
Just another kind of basic question that we can kind of frame the rest of the conversation around. Where and how did the anarchist movement as a material force that embraced a set of ideas and saw itself as anarchist, where did that come from? Because, again, you've mentioned already Japan, China, a couple different places, but I mean, it literally spread all over.
So I can first go through how the movement arose, and then I can go through how it spread around the world briefly. So this is something you could write a whole book about, so I'm going to be summarizing and kind of going very quickly. So between the 1840s and 1860s, there's a social movement which calls itself mutualism, which is originally developed by kind of skilled silk workers and artisans in Lyon, in France. And one of the people associated with that movement is Proudhon, who's the first person to call himself an anarchist. And within this movement, they end up advocating the abolition of capitalism and the state in favor of a decentralized market socialist society in which workers, either as individuals or within kind of collective associations, only possess land and means of production which they are occupying or using themselves. And they were in favor of peaceful social change, not because they were committed to non-violence, but because they thought the state was really powerful and they would win in a fight. And so they thought that they could use forming cooperatives with the aid of loans from a people's bank, which had really low interest rates or even no interest rates. So they would fund all these co-ops, they would grow in number and size, and over time they would take on more and more social functions until socialism has been established at a societal level. So that's kind of broadly what mutualism means in France during this period. And then what happens is that an organization is founded in 1864 called the International Workingmen's Association. And this is a kind of working class international social movement that's meant to bring workers from different parts of the world together in order to serve their collective interests for emancipation. And it's founded by English trade unionists and also French mutualists, and Karl Marx gets involved later after its founding. And there are a series of debates within the movement about what their goals should be, how they should organize, what their strategies are. And it's within this context that anarchism as a social movement emerges, which is to say that there's a tendency which arises, which differs from this previous social movement called mutualism, and from the ideas of Proudhon, who they are influenced by, but they are distinct from. And this tendency ends up being called anarchist, but there's a whole period where they use loads of different names. They call themselves federalists, revolutionary socialists, collectivists, and then over time, anarchism is the term that sticks. But what their ideas are is that they're committed to the collective ownership of land rather than just the collective ownership of the means of production. They're in favor of revolutionary trade unionism, and they're in favor of the abolition of capitalism in the state through an armed insurrection, which would forcefully expropriate the ruling classes. So they have a slightly different goal, but most importantly, different strategies from mutualism. And that's when anarchism becomes a social movement, is through a series of congresses in the First International, because it has several different sections in different parts of the world. And so anarchism emerges at congresses in Spain in 1870 and 1871, in Switzerland in 1870 and 1871 as well, and in Italy in 1872. And what then happens, which is really important, is that Marx and Engels, who are key members in the General Council of the First International, which is meant to be a kind of administration board, but what they instead do is that they try to impose decisions and policies on the organization's previously autonomous sections, specifically some kind of commitment to electoral politics. And this culminates in Bakunin and another anarchist called James Gilliam being expelled from the First International at its Hague Congress. In response to this, all the anarchist sections form their own new organization, which they view as the kind of direct continuation of the International. To them, it's the same organization, at a congress in Saint-Imier in Switzerland. And that was viewed by later anarchists as the founding of the movement. Although it's important to point out that after the first 1872 Congress, there are later congresses which were attended by state socialists from Belgium and from England. And it's only in the final 1877 Vevey Congress where all the delegates are representing anarchist groups. And so anarchism kind of begins to emerge as a movement, 1868 onwards. It's really forming and solidifying between 1870 and 1872. And then it's 1872, 1877 is when it really becomes what we call anarchism. And that's when they start using the term anarchist and anarchism more and more frequently, till by the time we get to the 1880s, that's really when anarchism, as we know it, fully formed. It's gone through its process of development, and now it's anarchism as we fully know it. And so now I'll go through how it spread, because what's really important to understand is that it's not the case that anarchism fully emerges in Europe and then essentially a European ideology is spread to the rest of the world. What instead happens is that it spreads around the world during its emergence as a social movement. So the 1877 Vevey Congress of the Saint-Imier International I just referred to was attended by delegates representing anarchist groups in France, Switzerland, Italy, Germany, Spain, Greece, Argentina, Mexico, Uruguay, and Egypt. So it's that early that it's already a social movement in Latin America and in Alexandria in Egypt. And how it spreads is through migrants. When they travel, they bring their ideology with them. People fleeing political repression. So you have people who survived the Paris Commune who go to Latin America and they bring, radical ideas with them, which then come into contact with the kind of local traditions of resistance and class struggle that are developing independently. And also through the international radical press. So, there'll be German newspapers, say, published in London or America, which are read by people around the world. So, they didn't have the internet, but they had their equivalent, which was these international press networks that disseminated their ideas throughout the world, and they'll be translated into loads of different languages. And they're also international social networks where, people, know each other. They put one another into contact with people, and this kind of spreads the ideas. Now, anarchism spreads to Asia at the beginning of the 20th century. So before then, it's in parts of Africa, but it's mainly a kind of North American, South American. It's in Cuba, and it's in Europe, in both Eastern Europe and Western Europe, and it is also beginning to be a movement in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. But it reaches Asia at the beginning of the 20th century. So to give two examples, in Japan, there's a state socialist called Kotoku Shusui, and he goes to live in America in 1905 after having suffered state repression in Japan. And he meets a bunch of anarchists in San Francisco. He reflects on the failure of electoral politics, and he becomes an anarchist. And then he returns to Japan, and he starts arguing that Japanese socialists should abandon electoral politics in favor of direct action, mass strikes, revolutionary trade unionism. He publishes a translation of a letter Kropotkin wrote to him. And also, they translate a lot of European anarchistic texts, but also they write their own, crucially. And around the same time, anarchism also spreads to China. So there are students who form this kind of international network, which is located in both Tokyo and Paris. And they then translate all these texts and also publish their own. And they then kind of shipped into China, where they reach a local audience. And so, that's how it emerges. That's how it spreads. And obviously it's still spreading to this day, but through our equivalents, where they had the radical press networks and patterns of immigration. We have, the internet or, social movements getting to know one another through discussion spaces, and like the Zapatistas currently going on their tour.
And you mentioned this already, but let's go back to it. What caused the split between anarchists and Marxists in the First International, and why is this important?
Okay, so this is one of the most complicated things ever in the history of socialism. And I'm going to do my best to summarize it without confusing anyone who doesn't know all the details. So it's often framed as like it's Marx versus Bakunin. It's this kind of clash of big personalities. And that's entirely false. It's about social movements with different strategies and kind of intrigue between, social movements within this organization. It's about large groups of people and not two famous individuals with big beards. It's about a lot of people with big beards and obviously, of course, women who are part of the organization. So within the First International, there's a divide between people who are in favor of electoral politics and people against electoral politics. Now, in the language of the time, this is reflected as a debate about what they call political struggle, by which they mean how we should relate to the state. So the proponents of electoral politics say, we need political struggle. We have to form political parties, engage in parliament. Otherwise, states will just do whatever they want, and we instead need to enter them and use this as a way to win immediate improvements, the improved living conditions for workers, also giving us a kind of big soapbox from which to spread radical ideas to everyone. And in response to this, the people who become the anarchists, but aren't technically yet anarchists, if you're being really pedantic, oppose this, and they call this bourgeois politics, is what they call electoral politics. They say we should reject this in favor of what they call the politics of labor, for which they mean direct action, trade unions, mass strikes. That's how we can impose our demands on both the economic ruling class, but also crucially the political ruling class. Like if we want a law to be passed, we don't have to enter parliament to do that. We can agitate in the streets for that to happen. Now, with that in mind, in Spain and Switzerland, which listeners will recall are two of the areas where anarchism as social movement emerges, they pass Congress resolutions for their section, which oppose electoral politics as a strategy. And Marx and Engels see this, and they wrongly think that this tendency is the expression of a secret conspiracy by Bakunin to take over the International and impose a narrow anarchist program onto the entire organization. And they think that Bakunin doesn't just want to take over the First International and kind of impose his program onto it, but he wants to be kind of a little dictator of it. And so from their perspective, Bakunin is this kind of former member of the Russian aristocracy who doesn't have good theory, who is trying to become a dictator of a proletarian social movement. And Marx and Engels think this because it's what loads of people they know are telling them. and they're shown some kind of documents Bakunin writes for himself, which are never implemented, which they think kind of demonstrate this conspiracy. And so, the historic record absolutely demonstrates that Marx and Engels were just factually wrong about what they thought was happening. Bakunin did organize a secret group called the Alliance. Some people claim it didn't exist. It did exist. It was just a informal international affinity group. It was a bunch of people who knew Bakunin, knew each other. They were into anarchism, or Bakunin was trying to get them into anarchism. And the program of the Alliance was written by Bakunin in 1868, and it did express what would later be viewed as anarchist ideas. But crucially, Bakunin argues over and over again in his private correspondence that the program of the Alliance absolutely should not be imposed or made the program of the International, because he thinks that the role of the International is to unite as many workers as possible on the basis of their shared class interests and engage in large-scale class struggle, like through trade unions and co-ops and so on. And therefore, we can't, for example, have a commitment to atheism, which is in the program of the Alliance, as part of the program of the International, because then all the Christian workers, which is a huge number of people at the time, will be excluded from the organization. Now, Marx and Engels don't know any of this, because obviously they don't have access to Bakunin's private letters. And so they then think that in order to save the International from Bakunin's plot, which isn't actually happening, but they think is, they have to essentially take over the organization before Bakunin does. So what they do is they organize a congress. Sorry, not a congress. This is very important. It's a conference, not a congress. They organize a conference of the International in London in 1871. Now, they deliberately pick the timing and location so that the majority of the sections of the International can't send any delegates. And what this means is that you have a meeting where you have 9 delegates from the sections of the International, and then you have 21 members of the General Council in London, including Marx and Engels, of which 12 can vote. So they have an automatic numerical majority, and they made decisions through majority vote, crucially. Now, during the meeting, they have a discussion about political struggle, which is becoming a big issue of debate in the organization, with different sections passing different resolutions on, what we should think about it. And there's a delegate at the London Conference called Vaillant, and he proposes this kind of quite vaguely written resolution saying that the political question and the economic question are interconnected. They're one and the same struggle against class society. Now, this is worded in such a way that it can actually be agreeable to both anarchists and kind of Marxists at the time, although neither really fully exist yet, because they both are in favour of political struggle, and they think the political struggle and the economic struggle are connected. They just disagree on how to go about doing it. Electoral politics, or we should reject electoral politics and just do direct action and trade unionism. Now, what happens is that at the meeting in London, they end up agreeing through this, majority on Marx's side, that we're going to have the General Council rewrite the resolution that Vaillant proposed into something kind of more elaborate and detailed. And it just happens to be the case that the person who wrote all the documents of the General Council was Marx. Now, a few delegates of the sections of the First International point out that this is in violation of the constitution of the organization and its kind of rules of operating, which is that it's meant to be the case that these kinds of resolutions can only be passed and made official policy of the organization at a full-blown congress where, delegates from all of the organization are there representing different sections. And that the General Council shouldn't actually be able to do this. But because they have the numerical majority, they do a vote, and it's agreed that, yes, Marx basically is going to rewrite Vaillant's resolution into something else, which he then does. And he rewrites what was a kind of quite vague claim about we need to do both political and economic struggle into the Marx's own position, which is that the workers' movement has to be formed into a political party aimed at the conquest of political power. And this is then printed as an official resolution of the First International in November 1871. And in response to this, the majority of the organization, including proponents of electoral politics, crucially, are very annoyed, and they argue that the General Council has abandoned the federalist structure of the organization and now it's imposing its own views onto the autonomous sections. And so this then leads to a split between the supporters of federalism and the supporters of the General Council on whether or not Marx's resolutions on political struggle should be binding on the entire organisation. And crucially, the majority of the organisation sided with the Federalists. So then what Marx and Engels do is they organise a congress in 1872 at The Hague, where they manage to expel Bakunin and Guillaume from the organisation. They move the location of the General Council from London to New York, and they formally commit the organisation at a congress this time to Marx's resolutions on political struggle. Now, the way they achieve this is that they create loads of fake delegates. So they spend ages writing letters to everyone they can think of, being like, hey, do you want to be a delegate at the Congress and vote for what I want you to do? Which they then do. So you have a Congress where loads of the delegates are representing kind of non-existent sections. A few of them are, in fact, I think one of them is absolutely a police spy. There are delegates who vote with the General Council, even though they've been mandated not to do that. And so it's a total sham.
Plus, it's in New York, too. So it's far away from where a lot of these people are.
Well, the Hague Congress is when it's still in London. This is the Congress at The Hague. And then after The Hague, it's moved to New York, where it kind of basically dies because it doesn't have a popular base in America. And Marx and Engels kind of knew this would happen. So from Marx and Engels' perspective, they've just saved the organisation from Bakunin. So yes, it has gone to America where it's going to really cease to function, but that's the point, because it means now there isn't anything for Bakunin to take over, because they wrongly think Bakunin tried to move the location of the General Council from London to near where he lived, so he could then take over the General Council. So that's why they move it to America, which is as far away from Bakunin as possible. So they think, yay, we've saved the day. All the social movements already in Europe can continue to exist, but now Bakunin isn't able to take them over and impose his anarchist ideas onto them. From the anarchist perspective, Marx and Engels, imposed their commitment to electoral politics onto the entire organisation. And it's out of this feud that then you have the Saint-Omer Congress happen, where then the majority of the organisation, so the Italian section, the Spanish section, the Swiss section, I'm not sure the French section. They were dealing with a lot of repression at that time, but they definitely attend later congresses. They formed the what I call the Saint-Omer International. They just called it the International. And then after they form it, you have state socialists from Belgium and London who affiliate with it, because they're not going to continue to be part of the kind of fake international that Marx and Engels have moved to New York. They want to be with the real social movement. So they affiliate with it, even though they're in favour of electoral politics. But they have loads of arguments, and then it eventually kind of falls apart by 1876 to 1877. And it's in this period where both anarchism, Marxism, and social movements arise. It's in the fallout of this massive very complicated series of conflicts and debates within, crucially, mass movements. It's not just Marx and Engels versus Bakunin. It's loads of people engaged in dialogue and discussion. And that culminates in a lot of, negative views on either side. So the Marxists write their own histories of what happened, where Marx and Engels are the good guys, and the anarchists write their version of events, where Marx and Engels are the bad guys and Bakunin is the good guy. And what I'm trying to suggest is that a crucial thing to understanding what happened is that Marx and Engels have a series of false beliefs about what is happening, which is namely that they're saving the organization from this Russian aristocrat trying to take over the organization. And the anarchists who have different information, think about it very differently. And as a historian, you have to look at everyone's point of view and kind of zoom out to understand the complexity of what happened. But I do think how Marx and Engels acted was wrong. I totally disagree with their behavior. But I can understand why they acted the way they did, given the false beliefs they had that I know was not the case, because I can read things that they couldn't.
Wow. You thought signal drama was bad.
Yeah. This is like 19th century Twitter drama.
Fascinating. I've never heard it laid out like that. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, that's a simplification, by the way. Like it's
for
more
sure.
Complicated. That's big brushstrokes. It's scarily complicated.
Right. Well, just going forward, you mentioned one of the first books you read, anarchist books, was The Conquest of Bread, which I find fascinating, because that's such a book I feel now that people kind of work themselves up to. But the person that wrote that, Peter Kropotkin, popularized the term anarcho-communism or anarcho-communist. And I think it's interesting because in today's experience, I feel like a lot of people, especially younger people, use that, or they use ANCOM, which seems to have become this idea that you can mix anarchism with Leninism or Marxist-Leninism and just create this weird combination of leftist ideologies. Can you flesh out for us what is anarcho-communism and what is it not?
To understand what anarcho-communism is, you have to understand what anarcho-collectivism is. So anarcho-collectivism, although historically they just originally call it collectivism, was a tendency in the First International which advocated the collective ownership of land, raw materials, and the means of production. And they were committed to the view that the products of labour, which is, all the things we make, should be owned by those who produce them. So the product to the producer is like a 19th century slogan. Or they thought that the worker was entitled to the full product of their labour, is another way of expressing it. Now, they initially don't really actually specify how to do this. They think that different communities will come up with their own way during the revolution, and that we as kind of organisers and radicals shouldn't prescribe how these really complex problems of distribution will actually be settled in practice during a revolution, which is, context varies so much in different local conditions, people who have different ideas. They think kind of people figure it out, but the guiding principle is each worker should be enjoying the full product of their labour. So, for example, at the 1877 Viver Congress, like the third time I'm mentioning it, doesn't get enough love. It's an important Congress. So at the 1877 Viver Congress, there are Spanish anarcho-collectivists, and they give a talk on what they think, and they describe their position as the collective ownership of the means of production and land, which gives autonomy to each community of producers, and each receives according to his production. So crucially, the autonomy part is really important to understanding here. Communities themselves are going to figure it out themselves. Then what happens is that a collectivist called Guillaume, who I've mentioned previously, he writes a pamphlet called The Ideas on Social Organisation, which was written in 1874, first published in 1876, although it is shared among, the drafts, as it were, are shared among Italian anarchists before its formal publication. Now, within this text, he does two very important things, which is that, first of all, he specifies how we can actually distribute the products of labour. And he suggests labour vouchers, which is when individuals receive a certain number of vouchers per hour or type of work performed, and they then use them to acquire items at a store. And then he thinks this is a kind of a temporary thing to do during and immediately after the revolution. But then once we've achieved abundance, he says we need to replace this labour voucher system to the principle of from each according to ability to each according to needs. And this is communism. Communism is this system of distribution from each according to ability to each according to needs. It was a common term among French communists like Blanqui. It's modern. A lot of people think Marx invented it now. He does use the expression, but he didn't actually invent it. It was a wider view within working class social movements of what communism meant. Now, what happens then is that, so we've had this complication to the original collectivist program. Originally it's like we're going to figure it out. Guillaume then specifies labour vouchers short term, but long term ultimately we're going to be going towards communism. But he doesn't call it that. And the reason why he doesn't call it that is at the time, communism is associated with different kinds of authoritarian state socialists, and crucially not just kind of Marx and Engels, because in their context there are loads of other people who aren't known now but were at the time in, for example, France. So people who read a person called Cabet, for example. Now we get to how anarcho-communism happens, which is that from 1876 onwards, there are a number of prominent anarchists, especially in Italy, but also France, like people like Reclus. So it's Reclus, Malatesta, Cafaro. They reject the anarcho-collectivist position that each worker should own the products of their labour in favour of anarcho-communism, which is, instead of each worker owning the products of their labour, the products of labour are collectively owned by humanity as a whole and distributed according to need. So anarcho-communism is a modification to anarcho-collectivism on how we should think about the distribution ownership of the products of labour. This then becomes the dominant majority position within the anarchist movement. There is a significant segment in Spain throughout the 1880s who are still into collectivism, but over time communism does become the majority position around the world. And sometimes if you read kind of historians, they will contrast, say, like anarcho-syndicalism and anarcho-communism as if they're different, and that's wrong. So anarcho-communism is just a view on the kind of society we want to create, and it didn't include its own specific set of strategies, because for them anarcho-communism was a synthesis of anarchism and communism. Communism is a system of distribution within an anarchist society, and so the strategies of anarcho-communism include all the different kinds of anarchists. So you have anarcho-communists who are against trade unions, you have anarcho-communists who are in favor of trade unions. Every single anarcho-syndicalist organization I've ever found was formally committed to the goal of achieving anarcho-communism. And so, as to go on to the kind of claim you made that apparently there's some people online who kind of mistakenly think it's like this kind of synthesis of anarchism and communism, or communism means Leninism, because what else would it mean? This is a really strange claim to a historian, because historically the Marxists always called themselves, when they became a social movement from the 1880s onwards, they called themselves socialists or social democrats. Now in this time, social democrat means that you're in favor of what they viewed as the kind of true democratic republic, which means, socialism to them. They call it the universal republic. And so social democracy, doesn't mean like welfare state capitalism in this period. It's a radical revolutionary program. They want to overthrow capitalism and achieve socialism. But yeah, these are the terms they use. There's Marx and Engels used the term communism before this, but Engels writes in a letter being like, we called ourselves communists to distinguish ourselves from socialists at the time, and basically in modern parlance, communism was kind of cooler as a word and was better branding, and so they used that. But then by the time of the 1880s, they're calling themselves socialists, and Engels is like, it doesn't really matter what word we use, let's use socialism, and that is what Marxists call themselves until there's a split in the Marxist movement when the majority of Marxist parties support their respective countries in World War I. There's then a split where the tendency splits from the Social Democratic Second International over this, and this includes crucially the Bolsheviks and Lenin in Russia, and they form a new international, and they rebrand themselves going back to the kind of original language of Marx and Engels in 1848, the Communist Manifesto, and they call themselves communists. So Marxism goes from being socialism, social democracy to communism. But that word isn't widely adopted by Marxists as a social movement, until, the Russian Revolution and World War I. In between the 1880s and this occurring, between like 1917, 1921, the main social movement, which calls themselves communists, is anarchism. Anarchism is the movement who consistently advocate communism, call themselves communists, have journals with communist in the title or in the subtitle of the paper. And so it's only someone who doesn't know any history who would think that, obviously communism means Leninism. Like, well, there's a whole period in history where, communism for loads of people means anarchism. And I find it frustrating that, people kind of, they're not aware of how complex it is, and they have mistaken assumptions, which I can understand how they have, but, aren't actually factual.
Yeah. And to be clear, the anarchists were also the people that critiqued Marxism and the push to obtain state power. Bakunin famously said that Marx's desire to capture the state and create a dictatorship of the proletariat would create a red bureaucracy and would rule over the working class as opposed to liberate it. So I just think that's important to point out, because in today's kind of dialogue, words like collectivist or communist, especially on the right, just essentially means like, left-wing fascism or something like that.
Well, so in the 1880s or 1970s, when they're adopting the term anarcho-communism, for them, communism is associated with certain kinds of authoritarian socialism. They call it barrack communism. So there's a quote of Bakunin in 1868, sorry. There's a speech Bakunin gives in like the late 1860s where he says, I'm not a communist. Communism is authoritarian. I'm in favor of freedom. And the reason why is because at the time there were people who called themselves communists who were in favor of, literally establishing a minority dictatorship of professional revolutionaries who'd impose their ideas on all of France, and, established kind of common ownership. It was often quite associated with certain kinds of patriarchy as well, where like you would have common ownership in these kind of small places where there were kind of male authority figures. When they, certain communists actually tried to create like kind of mini communist societies in America. And so this is what the term means to loads of the anarchists. And so therefore they always say that, anarchism means against the state and freedom. Communism means equality and distribution according to need. Anarchist communism to them is the synthesis of freedom against the state and equality, distribution according to need, and kind of common ownership. It's the synthesis of those things. So even for them at the time, it had these kind of authoritarian connotations, which they then were trying to disentangle themselves from. So this is the period in which the term libertarian communism is first used, in precisely in order to distinguish themselves from, say, French people at the time, where communism is associated with kind of authoritarianism. Obviously, we now have our own modern equivalents to that because communism has come to mean the USSR or Maoist China, and not a society free of all forms of class rule and oppression in which everyone is free, which is what it meant to anarchists historically.
Sure. And of course, when that term was first being used, those regimes had not even come about.
Yeah, they didn't exist, yeah.
This is the final moment of the beginning of our lives, watching the stars above the Barcelona sky. We'll wait for dawn with revolution in our eyes, when we'll face the men that Franco sent to die. Oh, that sin may crumble, and along with it our hopes, but we'll live in ruins, and we can call this city our own. Down with the landlords, the tyrants and the kings. Down with the bosses, the politicians and the thieves. We stand defiant, united to defend this
this would probably be my favorite question. I'm looking forward to hearing your answer to this. So historically, there's often been this tension between what we would call today formal forms of anarchist organization, so like federations, unions, like the C&T, which still exists today and is growing pretty largely once again, and also what is commonly termed insurrectionary anarchism, which favors sort of like networks and affinity groups and non-formal organizing. Let's talk about that tension historically. I mean, there's so many kind of points, and we were talking about this before the recording, that we can go back to in history of this kind of tension arising. People like Sacco and Vanzetti were famously part of kind of like the Galleanist lineage. In Spain, there were different kind of subsects of anarchists that favored certain forms of action over, for instance, like organizing the C&T, and there's examples of people taking up kind of both banners. But how did this tension arise, and what were the positions people had, and why did they have them?
Okay, so first I'm going to introduce the historic terminology, which is confusing. So historically, the debate, especially among Italians, is between organizationists and anti-organizationists. The organizationists are in favor of forming formal organizations, which are federations, which have things like Congress resolutions, congresses, delegates who are elected to form specific tasks, some kind of, say, rules for the organization to, which, let's say the organization has a rule that you can't join a political party and you do, then you'll be expelled. So that's like a formal organization. And they also advocated affinity groups. Now, affinity groups is a term that's kind of, as far as I'm aware, invented by Spanish anarchists. And each movement, they use equivalent language. They call them circles, is one of the common terms, as opposed to affinity group. But all it means is a small group of 4 to 20 people who are usually, close friends. They know each other well, and they will form to do a specific task, like you're doing an action, you form the affinity group, you do it, then you dissolve, or they're more or less kind of permanent groups. And they often have really good names, like the Right to be Idle group or the Dynamite group. They often come up with really cool names. Now, the anti-organisationists are against formal federations and just want to do affinity groups and informal social networks. And the way they would try to coordinate the informal social networks was through their equivalent of social media, which was newspapers. So you'd often have key periodicals, which would kind of be an avenue through which people could exchange information publicly, and thereby coordinate activity or share insights from struggle. So they weren't, the affinity groups weren't unconnected. They were connected through informal social networks, usually centered around periodicals. They would have massively benefited from Signal, but alas, they did not have it. So to reiterate, the debate wasn't about whether or not to organize, despite the terminology. So the anti-organisationists were in favor of organization. They just, for some reason, thought it was useful to say we're against organization and in favor of free association is the language they use. And other people at the time, like Malatesta, point out that, well, you are in favor of organization, we just disagree about how to do it. And even he points out that there are some anti-organisationists who are better organizing than some organisationists. And the debate isn't about whether or not to form affinity groups, because everyone involved agrees that there are situations where affinity groups are really useful. So even the strongest proponents of formal organization, like Malatesta, advocated affinity groups for things like armed struggle, because obviously when you're doing something really risky involving guns, you want to kind of have their equivalent of security culture, and affinity groups are a way to do that, because everyone, it's a small group of people who know each other really well, hard for the police to infiltrate. So they advocated different kinds of organization for different purposes, and sometimes people who kind of they can assume that it's about pro-affinity group, anti-affinity group. It's not about. It's really about are we going to do formal organization and affinity group, or just affinity group? Now, I agree with the organisationists, but I'm going to do my best to present a balanced account going through the anti-organisationist arguments and the organisationist ones. So first of all is that why do anti-organisationist ideas arise? Because initially anarchism, as I've already said, emerges within the federations of the First International. So originally, the anarchists within the movement, they were all in favour of federations because that's how they're organising automatically to be members of the International. How is it they go from that to being like, we're totally against formal federations, just affinity groups? Well, several reasons. So the first reason is obviously the actions of the General Council and Marx and Engels was an example in which something that was set up on paper to only do administration ended up taking on a life of its own and trying to take over the entire organisation. So they were really worried about that ever happening again. And so were kind of that meant they were very skeptical of any future attempts at formal organisation in case we had a repeat of the history of the International. Second of all, huge amounts of state repression. So in Italy, there was a period in which it was illegal to be a member of the International. They defined that they passed laws such that an anarchist group was by definition a criminal organisation, even if they hadn't actually broken any laws, and therefore could be arrested and imprisoned without charge because they were automatically criminals because they were anarchists. So there was a huge amount of state repression, and in those contexts, you have loads of people who are then going, okay, we're going to organise in secret, informal affinity groups that are really hard to infiltrate. If one gets repressed, it doesn't take out the entire organisation because we're decentralised, fragmented. And so it was originally adapted as a kind of strategic principle. And this usually went alongside in Italy with a commitment to armed struggle. So an anarchist called Carlo Caffero was in favour of guerrilla warfare. And it was against trade unionism as a strategy. And because he advocated this kind of insurgent, kind of immediate policy of armed struggle, he thought we have to do affinity groups where, one is attacking, and then when they go to that, another one attacks independently. And there's so many groups all attacking at once that the state gets overwhelmed and we win. That's the plan. But then what happens is that what was originally this kind of strategic principle within the context of state repression and a commitment to armed insurgency in Italy ends up becoming a matter of principle, which that they then start to argue that, well, it's not just that this is strategically advisable, given what we're trying to do in our immediate context. Also, formal organization is incompatible with anarchist principles. So they think that it's authoritarian to have a congress where you have delegates claiming to represent other people and speaking for them. They think that can't happen. You can only speak for yourself. So therefore it's authoritarian to have delegates at congresses. Or they think that congresses will make decisions through majority vote, and that's authoritarian. We should instead make decisions amongst ourselves through what they don't use the term consensus. They use the term, I can never say it, unanimity. I can never say it. This happens every podcast when I have to talk about it. But they mean everyone in the group has to agree, and congresses often make decisions through majority vote for passing resolutions. So they think that's authoritarian, and they also they think that due to the structure of the formal organisation, what will end up happening is that it kind of becomes concerned with reproducing itself, and becomes concerned with, we're going to recruit members for the sake of recruiting members, even if it doesn't actually help us in achieving our objectives. Because, on paper we're bigger, but we're not actually a more effective organisation. And that the orthodoxy of the organisation becomes the primary thing to reproduce. Rather than actually, responding effectively to the ongoing situation, we're going to repeat, what you might call the party line. Like, this is what the organisation thinks, therefore we're going to do this, rather than developing innovative ideas. And I think that's a product of the structure of the organisation, because it has a constitution, or it has Congress resolutions, which it has to refer back to. And so that's why they think affinity groups plus informal social networks, they're fluid, they're better able to deal with state repression, avoid infiltration, and they thought they're preparing, that because of their small size, it means they're much more compatible with making decisions through consensus, rather than large organizations, which then generally require majority vote in order to be able to do anything. And so that's the anti-organizationist position summarized. Now, what did the organizationists think in response? It's hard to work out the numbers, but it appears to be the case that numerically the majority of the historic anarchist movement were organizationists. But part of why that is that obviously trade unions, they keep numbers of how many people there are, while the anti-organisationists, we can at best go through how many people bought a newspaper. So it's hard to compare numbers, but it appears to be the case that the majority were organisationists. Now, what did they think? So although they understood there are contextual circumstances in which affinity groups are a very good idea, they didn't think that we should reject formal organisation as a matter of principle as being in violation of anarchist values and kind of long-term commitments. So they thought that, we're not the delegates within an anarchist organisation. They don't have decision-making power. They're delegated the completion of a specific task and are recallable by the group who elected them if they do anything different. So they're not in a position to kind of pull a Marx and Engels in the General Council and impose their views on everyone else. Second of all, they thought that federations were absolutely necessary to actually achieve anarchist goals, because in order to achieve anarchist goals, so both the struggle for immediate improvements and actually overthrowing capitalism and the state and reorganizing all of society, including the economy, organizing production, distribution, that requires a huge amount of large-scale coordination. And they weren't convinced that informal social networks and periodicals were sufficient to achieve that necessary level of coordination in order to both, overthrow the ruling classes, win immediate reforms, but also actually reorganize society in a way where, in a revolution, it's really important everyone gets food. So they think we have to really be very good at doing large-scale coordination. And if we don't, people die. So it's really important we do it effectively. And they observe situations, for example, in France, where you have, different affinity groups doing their own thing independently of each other. And this leads to, people reinventing the wheel because they're not in conversation with one another within a wider organization where they can share experiences and lessons. People are wasting energy because rather than combining their forces, they're just doing their own thing independently. And so therefore, we should have formal organizations which enable us to pursue a common plan and focus our energies on specific objectives. And they also think that formal organization actually expands the freedom of individuals. So they think that if you think of freedom in terms of one's possibility to do and be lots of different things, then formal organization, rather than restricting the freedom of the individual, actually expands it. Because when you're in a big organization, you can do things which you can't do as an individual or as a small affinity group, such as, say, organize a really well coordinated mass strike, which totally changes things. You're able to have that real possibility, so that freedom to engage in that action because of the big organization you're a part of. So the debate is both about strategy and tactics, but also disagreements about how to think about freedom and the way in which organizations relate to the question of freedom. But it's not just this abstract question about, are the members free? It's a very kind of real thing about, how do we make decisions? Should we have delegates? If so, how should we make sure that they don't become a leadership who then, become like a little central committee and order us all about? So it's a very practical question. And the debate could at times be very, sectarian and people shouting at each other. But also there were lots of attempts at, kind of clarifying and explaining what they thought and why, and also agreeing to disagree. You do your thing and we'll do ours, and we'll see who's right, through who gets the best results. And I think often when you're having big theoretical discussions about, how should we act as anarchists, it's often something that's actually going to be solved by real experiments in organizing, where we figure out what works through actually trying to do it rather than just kind of arguing abstractly with one another. So yeah, that's an attempt at explaining a really complex divide.
And just to be clear, I mean, as with anything, I think a lot of people that were touched by these movements or involved in them, or, went to meetings, read the papers, were involved in these groups, probably crossed over in some regards to.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely the case. So, you can look at the papers people subscribe to and find they were subscribing to papers from loads of different tendencies. They were, you have some people who are very much like, I am a anti-organizationist and I hang out with the anti-organizationists and they're my people. But obviously there are loads of other people who are, they're mixing and matching ideas from loads of different sources, and they're not kind of strictly sectarian. There was sectarianism, but there were also attempts to overcome it. And again, lots of just kind of rank and file members of the anarchist movement, would listen to loads of different writers for different periodicals.
Like, there's a great photo we have. We did a podcast discussion with Professor Peter Cole about the history of the IWW, and there's a great photo, I think, from like New Jersey, and it's like an an anarchist center, and it's like in the front was like a newspaper for, I think, an Italian anarchist publication. In the back was like an IWW hall. And it just kind of shows like just that even though they disagreed with each other, they were still like in the exact same space.
Well, yeah, there were a few pictures of historic like anarchist paper sellers where they just covered in newspapers from around the world, different languages, different tendencies. It's the equivalent to kind of you follow loads of people you don't necessarily agree with just to get different perspectives. People in the past were the same.
Just following you, you have a special place in your heart for Malatesta. Why is Malatesta so important?
Okay, so Malatesta is first of all very historically interesting because he becomes an anarchist when he's a teenager, when he's 18, at the birth of the anarchist movement. And then he dies in, I believe, 1932, which is the period where anarchism in Europe is about to be and is being repressed by fascism in places where it previously had been, some of its largest areas, such as, Spain and Italy, but also Germany. And that was sad. But the consequence of having been active for this period is that he's a really good source for the history of anarchism and how it develops, because he's there from the beginning to this kind of period of, decline due to repression by fascism. And so he contributes to loads of the key debates. He develops a lot of the key ideas. He is one of the inventors of anarchist communism. He knows loads of the key figures and actively participates in social movements. He traveled all over the world. He spent a lot of time in prison as well. So there's loads of events where, Malatesta just pops up because he happens to be in town. Or he contributes to a key debate in his paper. So he's this recurring, really worthwhile person to study in order to understand the history over this entire period, as opposed to, say, someone like Bakunin, who's only really an anarchist for, say, 8 years and then dies in 1876, and doesn't see, all the later developments. Now, as for why his ideas are so good, like that could be a whole podcast. So I'm just going to touch on, kind of give an example, which is debates around syndicalism. So in the anarchist movement at the time, there's a debate about how they should relate to the trade union movement. And there's a tendency which calls itself revolutionary syndicalism, which argues that we should form trade unions that are politically neutral. So anyone can join, but we're not affiliated with a political party. So we're not tied to electoral politics. And they thought that the trade union was sufficient to achieve revolution. So it was the organization which could overthrow capitalism in the state through a general strike, and was the means through which we could reorganize the economy and society in general. And Malatesta has a kind of interesting response to this debate, where he kind of agrees with the commitment to political neutrality. He's like, yeah, we shouldn't form anarchist unions. We should form general unions that unite workers in general. But syndicalism isn't sufficient to achieve our goals. He was worried about kind of anarchists being absorbed into the trade union movement and losing an independent existence, where they become overwhelmingly concerned just with winning immediate improvements, which he did advocate, but that what was a kind of means becomes an end, and they lose sight of their long-term goals of achieving anarchy, an anarchist society. And so he thinks that anarchists should form specific anarchist organizations, which are federations composed exclusively of anarchists, and that these anarchist federations should participate in mass struggles, including trade unions, but not just, in order to spread anarchist ideas, win immediate improvements, lead by example. So, if there's a strike, we should get involved, help people out, and thereby show anarchism in action as an effective way to change the world, and thereby, persuade workers that they should also, become anarchists or act like anarchists, even if they don't identify as one. And this often gets kind of misrepresented as that Malatesta was against syndicalism. He wasn't in the sense of revolutionary trade unionism. He was a proponent of revolutionary trade unionism from kind of the 1880s onwards, although increasingly from the 1890s onwards it becomes kind of a bigger commitment. What revolutionary syndicalism means at the time is this specific view that the trade union is sufficient unto itself. And he rejects that, being like, no, trade unions aren't sufficient. We also need dedicated anarchist organizations, rather than us just kind of becoming one and the same with the trade union movement. And I think that's like a valuable contribution to like a complex debate. And he always kind of writes so clearly that, it's very easy for a modern person to follow along. Most of what he wrote was short articles. He never wrote like a big book. So he's really easy to read if you're a kind of tired person, because most of what he wrote is a few pages, or at most, say 30 to 40 pages. But, most of them are very short, so you can kind of dip in and out, get some clarity. He explains everything very clearly, and he goes through all the anarchist basics. If you read The Conquest of Bread, you don't get the basics, because that's not what the book was meant to be. It's about the feasibility of implementing communism during a revolution in France, modelled on the lessons of the Paris Commune of 1871. It's a contribution to ongoing debates in working class social movements in the 19th century about the feasibility of restructuring the economy. It's not meant as like an introduction to anarchism. And so if you want a kind of historical introduction to anarchism, I recommend beginning with Malatesta rather than Kropotkin. Do read Kropotkin. Kropotkin is worth reading. But Malatesta's pamphlet Anarchy and his anarchist program, both of which are on the Anarchist Library and are in the Method of Freedom anthology, they cover the basics about, what the anarchist goal is, why we should abolish the state, what states are, what strategies we should generally use to achieve this. And it's all very practical, very clearly expressed, and crucially, to the point. And I'm a big fan, in case it's not clear. But, obviously don't just read Malatesta, read other people. I just like him, but I like other people as well, but anyway.
For sure, and he also famously debated with a lot of people, including Machno, about the program, or the platform, that Machno published after he left the Ukraine.
Yeah, he participated in loads of the major key debates, which is why, he's a really good person to read to get a kind of a perspective.
One other big question I'm really looking forward to hearing from you, and again, this is something that we could spend a whole podcast on, but how did anarchists in the late 1800s and early 1900s relate to the wider working class and just everyday people in the United States specifically?
Okay, so first point to make is that the anarchist movement in the United States was overwhelmingly immigrants. So they were Spanish, Italian, Yiddish. So they were Jewish, but they spoke Yiddish, the language, and German, Russian, and there was an English-speaking anarchist movement. It just wasn't as large. So the largest movements were, say, the Yiddish, the Russians, the Italians. Which one's largest varies. Like originally the Germans are largest because they're the first, but then new waves of immigration happen. And the other interesting point to make is that most of the immigrants become anarchists in the United States. So they don't bring anarchism with them in the majority of cases, although some do. And so what happens is they come to America, they're full of hopes and dreams, the American dream, etc. And then they work in sweatshops and suffer brutal poverty and exploitation, and they realize it was all a lie, and America isn't, the land of the free and the home of the brave, etc. And so they become radicalized and decide to overthrow class society, as one does. Now, how did this working class social movement relate to the wider working class in America? Keeping in mind that numerically it was mainly immigrants, although crucially, to reiterate, it wasn't just immigrants. There were English-speaking anarchist papers like The Alarm, which were important, or Alexander Berkman being there, for example, who wrote a lot of stuff in English. Now, the main ways they relate are through newspapers published in all their different languages. And the combined circulation kind of ranges from an estimated about 20,000 in the 1880s, which is the beginning of the anarchist movement in America, to a height of kind of over 100,000 around 1910. And then the movement kind of declines because of the Palmer raids, where the anarchist movement in America is smashed through state repression due to them opposing American intervention in World War I. And then patterns of migration change, and loads of the immigrants kind of become Americanized, and so they lose their kind of radical basis in immigrant communities. There's lots of complex reasons, but it kind of goes into decline. But during its peak, 100,000 so it's reaching a lot of people in loads of different languages. And it wasn't just a numerical thing, it was also kind of culturally significant, these periodicals. So the Yiddish anarchist paper, the Freiarbeiter Stimme, I hope I'm saying right, apologies Yiddish speakers if I'm not, it was one of the most widely read anarchist papers. And it didn't just contain, anarchist theory, complaining about capitalism. It was also viewed as, including by non-anarchists, as general members of the Yiddish community, as an esteemed source of poetry, short stories, literary criticism. And there were a number of prominent Yiddish writers who were first published or found their kind of popular audience through an anarchist paper. So a lot of these anarchist papers were culturally significant within their communities, as opposed to just being this kind of purely, we just talk about anarchism papers. The other way that they related to the wider working classes was through speaking tours. So kind of pick a prominent anarchist in this period and they went on a speaking tour. Emma Goldman went on loads of speaking tours. She spent a huge amount of her life on trains, going about America, giving talks. Kropotkin visited America and did a speaking tour. Galini, the Italian anarchist, did.
Lucy
Moss,
Parsons
the German
as well.
anarchist. Yeah, Parsons also did talks. She would often talk about like the history of the Haymarket, because her partner had died during state repression. So loads of anarchists would give these speaking tours, and they all had kind of different speaking styles. But one of my favorite examples is in 1895. There's an Italian anarchist called Petro Gori, who's kind of like a anarchist folk singer. He's kind of like 19th century equivalent of Bob Dylan, but with good politics. And he writes loads of songs about revolution and anarchist ideas. And he travels to New York in 1895, and he goes on this huge speaking tour where he gives 400 lectures on anarchism in a single year, which is that is an impressive amount of content. And what he would do is that he would start singing his songs, which would gather a crowd. And once they were there for the music, he would put his guitar aside and then launch into a talk on anarchism, and then try to form an anarchist group from the people who turned up to initially hear his songs and then stayed for the talk, which I think is a kind of fun way of spreading anarchism in the 19th century. The other thing they would do is they would organize plays, picnics, dances. So they had kind of a social life, and this was one of the ways that they would meet people from the community. So it wasn't just the kind of the dedicated organizing meetings where few people turn up. They would organize these big social events which would draw in lots of people and kind of connect them with the wider anarchist movement. And these weren't just kind of recreational fun activities or how to kind of reach a wide audience or form bonds of support and cooperation with the wider community. They were also, in fact, one of the main ways that they raised money, especially for political prisoners. And so they had this kind of also very practical function in terms of raising funds for strikes and paying for people in prison and getting them legal support. Kind of final example is they were heavily involved in the trade union movement. Not all. There were anarchists at the time who were against being involved in trade unions, but there were a lot of anarchists who were in favour, and they played a key role in founding the IWW, which obviously still exists today. It was kind of reformed. And they played a role in loads of strikes. They helped win, many significant victories. Importantly, it wasn't just anarchists. It was always anarchists as part of a wider coalition that they intervened in or participated in to improve, working conditions and decrease the length of the working day. But one of the issues that they faced when kind of relating to the wider working classes in America is that because a lot of them were immigrants, and America is a really racist country, and in this period, a lot of these people were in the process of becoming white. So, Italians, for example, there's a period where they're not really viewed as white. They're their own thing. They're Italians. And then they become white. And this process is ongoing when the anarchist movement is at its kind of height in America in this period. And so the immigrant workers experience, racism and prejudice from these kind of white Americans born in America who look down on the immigrants and view them as scary radicals who are coming over to America with these, European communist ideas, wanting to change everything and, messing everything up and upsetting the kind of natural order. And that was a major issue they tried to overcome and deal with, but obviously was difficult because some people are just really prejudiced, and it's hard to do. It's kind of like the 19th century equivalent of a really ingrained Trump supporter. There's only you can try, but there are limits to how effective you can be. And there were, of course, again, to reiterate, loads of attempts by immigrants, but also by kind of American-born people to organize the English-speaking workers rather than it just being people whose primary language was Italian or Yiddish or German. There were also a lot of moral panics in the press around anarchists, because there was a wave of assassinations that a few anarchists carried out against various heads of state from the 1890s onwards, and this is where the association of kind of anarchism and bombs comes from. And some anarchists were in favour, some were against, some thought tactically not advisable, but it's morally justifiable to, say, assassinate a head of state who's just ordered the massacre of civilians in a strike. And so there were loads of moral panics that made it difficult for anarchists to organise, because loads of people just read the mainstream press. Well, okay, anarchists are these scary people who want to destroy society. And there was also another massive moral panic about anarchism due to their opposition to World War One, where again, because a lot of them are immigrants, it's viewed as these, un-American people preventing, the glory of the American military saving the day and being great. And so it's a complex topic, how anarchists related to the wider working class in America. I could have just talked about all the positives, but I think it's also important to talk about the challenges they faced, due to a lot of them being immigrants, and due to the prejudices which lots of people had due to the mainstream press and the education system, that anarchists still to this day have to try and navigate and overcome to achieve our goals.
You're listening to It's Going Down, part of the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network. Follow us online at itsgoingdown.org and on Twitter at IGD_news. If you like and appreciate this podcast, go to itsgoingdown.org/shop and give us a one-time donation. Sign up to donate monthly or donate through Bitcoin. Again, that's itsgoingdown.org/shop to support. And now, back to the show. In your view, what are some of the most successful examples of anarchist organization, organizing methods, or examples of anarchist action or intervention that we can learn from today?
So when a lot of people ask these questions, they'll kind of point to like the big revolutionary experiments, right? So Spain 36, the Mexican Revolution, anarchism in Manchuria, the Free Territories in Ukraine, the Italian factory occupation movement in the kind of early 1920s that anarchists were heavily involved in. And in our circumstances of kind of climate change and the fossil fuels industry destroying the Earth and the potential for human existence in a kind of okay way. I think a really key source of inspiration is when anarchists have managed to force bosses and politicians to give in to popular demands through direct action. So they've achieved immediate improvements without having to do electoral politics, just through direct action. And I think that's a really inspiring thing, given our current situation, when lots of people being like, we got to do electoral politics to save the planet. And it's like, no, we don't. We can just do direct action like historic socialists did and won. So I'm going to give two quick examples. So if you're a French person listening and have ever enjoyed time off from work on the weekend, you should be thankful to, among other people, dead anarchists in France. So in 1906, the CGT, which is the syndicalist trade union in France that at this point anarchists are heavily involved in and in key positions, like loads of the editors of the main CGT papers or key the main kind of administrative people of the organization are anarchists. And they decide to launch a strike for the 8-hour day, which people have been petitioning Parliament for some time, but obviously Parliament doesn't care and doesn't listen to their demand. So anarchists played a key role in organising this strike, and it was composed of around 295 separate strikes, over 12,000 businesses in France, which demanded different kinds of reduction to the working day. Some demanded 8-hour a day, others demanded 9-hour a day, but they all advocated some kind of reduction. And around 200,000 workers participated in this strike. So it was a very large strike, especially for the time period. Some of the strikes lasted over 100 days, although it's important to keep in mind that the individual strikes, only about 10,000 out of the, only about 10,000 workers of the around 200,000 who participated managed to force a capitalist to give them a reduction in the working day, which is significant for those 10,000, but obviously, all the others wanted that as well. But this is where the crucial victory comes in, is that due to this mass strike action, the French political ruling class respond from this pressure from below, from this direct action campaign, which they do, brutally repress. They arrest loads of the organizers, including loads of anarchists, is that they pass a law granting workers a mandatory day off work once per week. And this is obviously like a huge thing, for working class people who are working huge amounts of hours, that they at least have a day off. And that was won through direct action, imposing pressure, disrupting the normal functioning of things. And they were able to, win that, even though France doesn't gain the 8-hour day nationally until 1919. But the CGT and anarchists in France, did continue to organize for it, through direct action. And over time, it is won due to a variety of factors. So that's one kind of example of direct action crucially imposing pressure on the state to pass a law, as opposed to just, some capitalists changing things at their level. Second example is in February 1919, the CNT, which is the Spanish anarcho-syndicalist trade union, they organize a strike at the Barcelona offices of the Anglo-American electricity company called Elbro Power and Irrigation. And now, the reason why this is interesting is that, like a lot of big strikes, it begins as a little strike and then kind of snowballs. So, if you're thinking about organizing a big strike, that often how it is and actually happens. It's often that you have a strike in a particular workplace that then becomes generalized into a mass upheaval. And this is what happens in this case. So workers are fired for attempting to form a union. The company refuses to give in to the worker demands for higher wages and the reinstatement of the workers who've been fired. And so the CNT then organizes a strike at the company's electricity generating plant. And this results in, the lights being turned off in Barcelona, trams being stranded in the streets, a huge disruption, which is precisely why this kind of strike activity is effective, because it disrupts, and that's a necessary part of achieving social change. And the strike then grew from what was originally just in the electricity company to all the city's gas, water, and electricity workers. And the reason why they go on strike is because the Spanish state sends the military to try and restore the power supply. So then in response, all these other workers join the strike and it snowballs. Then loads of workers outside of Barcelona also join the strike. And so it becomes this huge mobilization. And throughout the strike, they engage in diversity of tactics. So you have workers who engage in, sabotage to prevent scabs from being able to get production going again and get the power back on. They would cut the transformers and power cables to prevent them from restoring power to the city. You have the printers union, and this I find really funny, is that the printers they refuse to publish any of the Spanish state's proclamations calling up workers for military service. So then because if they're called up for military service, then if they don't go to work, then now they're subject to military law and can be imprisoned. But the printers union was just like, yeah, we're not going to print that. So then workers won't know about it. So then they won't be affected by it. Or they would not publish articles in the press which were against the strike. And they even chose not to publish an announcement by the managers of the electricity company, which said that if workers didn't return to their job by March 6th, they would be fired. And they imposed kind of censorship on the ruling classes in order to protect the morale of the strike and sustain it through direct action based on their control over the productive process. Because obviously, without printers, you can't print things. So if they get organized and go like, no, we're not going to go along with this, it's huge societal effects. And I find that really inspiring. Now, this militancy culminates in them being able to win, loads of their demands. So they get an increase in pay. Workers are paid for the time they were on strike. They get the 8-hour day at the specific workplace, and the workers who lost their jobs due to participating in the strike or joining the initial union will be reinstated. Now, here's the crucial thing, is that then the Spanish Prime Minister, decrees the 8-hour day in the construction industry, and then says it's going to be expanded to all industries on the 3rd of April. And so this is how Spain wins the 8-hour day. It's through a massive strike that begins as a small strike, escalates and snowballs based on diversity of tactics and workers in different professions working together based on solidarity and cooperation to force the ruling classes to give in to their demands. And in order to kind of calm popular discontent, they get this massive legal change. Although it is important to note that even after the legislation was passed, obviously loads of companies are like, we're not going to enforce the law, just like it's illegal, say, to steal tips, but loads of companies do that, as anyone who's worked in a restaurant knows. And so they would then have to continue to go on strike in order to make the law change for the 8-hour day actually be implemented. And another thing I find really inspiring about this is, in both cases, there's huge amounts of state repression in both France and Spain. After the events I just described, the CNT actually launched another general strike to ensure all their political prisoners are released, who are in a kind of fortress where there's a long history of torture that they're aware of. And in response, the state arrests everyone they can. They close down all the headquarters. The organization has to go underground. But despite this state repression, they were still able to win, this huge reform through direct action. And so even if, say, in the short term you have a defeat in one sense, as in they did suffer the state repression, it did negatively affect them. In the long term, huge victory, huge gain, significantly changed society. And still to this day, in France we have the weekend. In Spain, there are laws around the working day, and anarchists are a core part of why that happened. And that I find very inspiring, and hopefully can inspire us as we try to struggle for our equivalents of the 8-hour day, such as trying to make it so that the fossil fuel industry isn't able to continue destroying the kind of ecological world that we live in.
Well, last question before we kind of sign off. We've been talking now for almost 2 hours about a lot of old stuff. Why is it important that we learn from these past movements? Some people would say this is so far back. How does this potentially relate to what's happening today? What do we gain from looking at the past?
Okay, so that's a lot. I'll try to be quick. So first of all is obviously we can learn from their mistakes and be inspired by their attempt to deal with those issues. So to give one example, there was a lot of sexism in the historic anarchist movement because just like today, lots of people are socialized to be sexist and then reproduce sexism. And this included people who'd otherwise, managed to unthink their socialization and, reject capitalism and the state and want a free society, but still, practice, say, treated women badly. And in response to that, women would organize women-only groups, print feminist literature, write articles critiquing sexism in the movement. And so, the key inspiration is that issues we're facing today in the movement aren't new. People in the past also had to deal with them, which for me at least makes it feel less lonely. Like, the past isn't a golden age. They had problems as well, just like we do. And two, we can look at how they try to overcome it and be inspired by that and be like, okay, just like they organized this women's group in order to fight against sexism in the movement or, sexual violence in the movement, so can we do today. And that I at least find personally helpful. Another example is more theoretical. So even if the specifics of historic anarchism are for a different time and place, like say, hypothetically, we can't do certain kinds of strategies that they did. Like I personally wouldn't advise in America the Italian anarchist policy of immediate armed struggle that they tried to do unsuccessfully in the 1870s. Like I don't think that's a realistic strategy for contemporary American conditions when anarchism is as small as it is in America. Okay, so that obviously isn't relevant, right? Like reading their texts on like guerrilla warfare aren't immediately obviously relevant to like me living in London right now or someone living in New York. But what is relevant is a lot of their overarching strategic principles which guide the specific tactics they adopt in their circumstances. So one example is the unity of means and ends. Now what this means is that the means we engage in determine the ends we arrive at. So if we want to create a free anarchist society, then we have to choose means, so strategies and tactics, that both can achieve those goals, but also crucially develop the kinds of people who are both capable of and driven to create an anarchist society. So if you want to create a society where people make decisions through general assemblies, that's the end, then we need to choose means that enable people in the present to make decisions in general assemblies, to self-manage their lives, and thereby become the kinds of people who can create a self-managed society. Or to give another example, if we want the ends of a stateless society, we shouldn't use the means of participating in the existing state, because that's incompatible with us achieving our long-term goal. Because instead of us achieving a stateless society, what will happen is we'll be changed through participating in the state and become concerned with reproducing the institution itself rather than achieving our actual goal of abolishing it. And so what was once a means will become an end. It will become self-replicating. Therefore, this is the key insight of historical anarchism. Anarchist means can only be used to achieve anarchist ends. And that, I think, remains relevant today, even if you think some of the specifics of historic anarchism aren't relevant anymore. There are core insights which I think we can use. And I try to focus in my work on articulating those core insights because, I'm not studying history just because I'm interested in it, although I am interested in it. I'm trying to study history in a way that's actually helpful for people alive today and isn't just me nerding out, that it helps people learn lessons and take insights from people who were just like us and were trying to change the world and thought a lot about it. And some of the things they thought, I think, are still worth looking at and talking about.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. How can people follow your work?
So I have a Twitter account. So type in like anarcho-pack and you'll get it. I'm Zoe Baker. I also have a YouTube channel, which that's where all the hard work goes into the YouTube channel. On Twitter, I just kind of mess around, post random things, argue with people on the internet. YouTube is where my serious work is. And so subscribe, watch the videos, follow me on Twitter. I also have a blog which has my reading lists on anarchism, Marxism, feminism, if people want to learn more, and also has scripts of my videos if you'd rather read than kind of listen to me try to read my script out. I'm currently in the process of turning my PhD thesis on the revolutionary strategy of anarchism into a book. But that's, work in progress, but there will be a book. It's going to happen. Hopefully people will like it. And it goes through everything I've talked about, but in a kind of scary amount of depth. Not scary, that's the bad one. In an exciting amount of depth. I hope will be a useful resource for people who, don't have time to spend 5 years reading everything they can on the subject. Instead, they can kind of read a broad overview and go, oh, cool, thanks. That's the goal.
This has been the It's Going Down podcast. Check itsgoingdown.org for daily updates, columns, action reports, and news. Go to itsgoingdown.org/shop to support us and follow us on all social media platforms. IGD, your daily resource for insurgent proletarian life.